And
What's going on, everybody? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the X299 launch event brought to you by ASUS and Corsair. I'm Kyle of BitWit, obviously, broadcasting to you from the Corsair Gaming Room here in beautiful Fremont, California. It's a beautiful day. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Paul, and some other of our panel of our reps who know many things. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves to the audience.
that's right, Kyle. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul. My YouTube channel is Paul's Hardware. Big thank you to ASUS and Corsair for inviting us out today. We have a ton of stuff to talk about with X299. We're going to do some questions later on in the broadcast. And before then, we're going to get a bunch of knowledge out of the heads of these guys right here. So starting off on my right, JJ.
Hi, everybody.
We all love JJ.
Thanks for tuning in, and also thanks for you guys that have turned out here locally. So for those of you that don't know, my name's JJ. Work for ASUS. I'm part of our core product marketing and techno marketing team, and hopefully be giving you guys some really interesting information about this really cool platform and a lot of the work that we've done to really be able to showcase what you can do with this platform.
Cool. I'm George. I'm a huge computer nerd, so I'm the guy from Corsair. I'm going to answer Corsair questions. So ASUS obviously has all the motherboard stuff they can talk about. The feedback is obviously mine also. The other thing we'll talk about is some of the memory stuff and some of the power requirement stuff and cooling stuff for X299 today. So I'll answer most of those things as we go forward.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And thank you all. Thank you all. Yes. Give a round of applause. Round of applause for our panel here. Excellent. And a round of applause for yourselves as well for making it out here. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're going to have some stuff here for you as well, including food. You've probably already seen some food trucks outside. Gaming, obviously, and prizes are all had for our IRL viewers here. For all of you in chat, you get nothing. I'm just kidding. You get to enjoy the beauty of the stream, all the information that's going to be flowing out of it, and you're going to be able to ask some questions later on during the stream. So on that note, Paul, I believe you have a couple questions already wrapped up for our panel here. If you want to go ahead and fire some stuff off for this big launch and what it's all about.
Certainly. First question is for ASUS, and we're starting you off at the $1,000 price. We'll move up from there until you can eventually win $1 million. That was a terrible joke. All right, so this launch is the Intel X299 platform. It includes a pretty big stack of CPUs. There's a set of them that's launched right now, and there's a few more that are coming down the line, going all the way up to 18 cores with an Extreme Edition. I have to imagine, as a motherboard manufacturer, dealing with a product stack like that, you have multiple PCI lane configurations to deal with, has to introduce some challenges. How have you guys dealt with the different configurations that are available with Kaby Lake X, Skylake X, and the different CPUs available on X299?
That's a really great question, and actually, initially, it's not really something that it's new for us. I mean, for all intents and purposes, even if you take a look at Z270, so Intel's current kind of mainstream enthusiast chipset platform, while there's a more limited number of PCI lanes that exist on there, and there's definitely a smaller amount of total CPUs that you have within the product stack, you still deal with the same type of complexity in terms of price bands that people are going to be building at. Am I building a $600 box, $800 box, $1,000 box, $1,500, $2,000? And then you still have to deal with a lot of the adding controllers, right? And this has always been one of the challenges that has happened now as boards get more and more feature rich, right? You're seeing that, you've got dual NICs, you've got Wi-Fi, you've got, secondary USB 3, you've got secondary SATA controllers, right? And on most motherboards, you're always going to make compromises. So this is something kind of we're already aware of, and now it's just kind of more so the challenge I think comes into play is that with the CPU that you're buying into, which CPU, so take for instance, like if we're talking about like the entry level, right, with the the 7640X or the 7740X, so the actual Kaby Lake X parts, how that plays into which board might make most sense for you. But beyond that, it's kind of we scale up. I think for us, more importantly has been what are you interested in as a builder, right? And so for us, what we've now been developing now for quite a number of years is a really wide stack. So I'm sure probably a lot of you that are here and watching on the stream have seen that we've got a lot of boards. And we've got multiple series now. So we were really the first vendor to have multiple series. So now we have 5 formal series that really kind of define different target audiences. So we've got Strict series, which is new. It's underneath our ROG series. We have formal ROG series motherboards. We have the Tough series, the Prime series, and even our Workstation series. And so I think the challenge is figuring out how do we differentiate those boards? And that hopefully as kind of we go through this kind of discussion in this kind of panel, we'll give you insights into how the boards differentiate themselves to figure out what's the right board for you. I think that's really the challenge that we've fought. But I'm really excited to say for X299, we have a very big launch platform. So we're going to have 2 tough boards at launch, we're going to have 2 prime boards at launch, and we're going to have a strict series boards at launch. So quite a bit of the price band that I think builders are going to be interested in are covered pretty well.
And right now, of course, pre-orders are available for a ton of motherboards as well as processors on this line. And I've seen on quite a few online retailers where you can buy them. They're going to be shipping out to people on Monday, so just a couple days from now. So if you guys are interested in this platform and investing in it, you can actually make your purchase now, and you'll get them shipped out very, very soon. I know, coming from my personal perspective, I've been on the high-end desktop platform from Intel for quite a while. I started off with X58 way back in the day, and I've always invested into it simply because while it is certainly a higher cost platform than, say, the mainstream platform from Intel, of course, it's what you have to do to get the most amount of power available. So everything else aside, I think the excitement over the pure power that's available on this platform is something that hopefully enthusiasts out there can get somewhat excited about. And then, of course, this entire line of motherboards from ASUS, I think you guys have done a really good job in providing different setups for different people in different situations. So,
one point to that, though, is that I think that's important. You know, sometimes I think even with you guys as reviewers, right, there's always kind of a perception of an immediate contrast of how people compare boards to the immediate previous generation. And while that's definitely fair, and you have to look at that, and we look at it because, of course, we produce a wide range of refresh X99 series motherboards, there's a lot of users out there that are on the stream or here that might be running systems from first generation X99, might be on X79, they might even be still on X58. I know tons of people that are on Gulftown era, right? And you don't want to just be looking at the aspects of performance, right? So in question of like, am I getting better DDR4 frequencies? DDR4, maybe I'm running a DDR3 platform. Am I looking at more cores, more cache, more frequency, right? There's a lot of the stuff that's baked into the chipset, right? Do you have a system that runs native USB 3? Does it have 3.1? Does it have M.2? Does it have NVMe support? Is it even running a native UEFI, right? If we go back to X58, all those things, none of them exist natively within the chipset. So sometimes if we're not taking into contrast that most people generally upgrade in an arc of about 2 to 4 years, right? Most people that are probably considering actually X299 are not X99 users. They're not Z270 users. They're from previous generations. So I think it's important to kind of take a look at is that where's that upgrade path? And I think the thing that Intel did that's really exciting to your point is they've brought down the entry point on the CPU side and for us on the motherboard side down to the lowest it's ever been for the highest end platform.
all right, next up we have a question for Corsair, for George over there.
Yep.
You guys make memory, I've heard.
Yeah, it's one of the things.
Okay, is there any special choices that you guys have made in developing memory specifically for this platform? And then beyond that, is there anything that people should have as far as expectations when it comes to memory overclocking?
Yeah, it's actually really kind of interesting the way that that X299 is set up because X99 was quad channel, as you guys remember, and it was pretty easy because you knew if you were going to buy an X99 motherboard with a processor, you just bought quad channel RAM, and they all had really similar performance when it came to memory overclocking because they had the same memory controller, the same CPU architecture. With 299, they have kind of the Kaby Lake X processors, which are dual channel, but then also the Skylake X, which is quad channel at the top end. So we had to kind of add different kits. So depending on, you can't just have a Base and Falls or X299 memory kit and say you're good to go. You have to say which processor you're actually using because that has some significant impact. So if you buy the 7740X or the 7640X, which are the Kaby Lake X processors, you can get some really good memory clocking performance because generally the lower the number of memory ranks you're using, the faster you can go. So we've seen, which is no surprise to any Kaby Lake fan, if you got a Z270 setup or Z170 setup with a Kaby Lake on it, we've seen some really fast performance in the lab. We've seen 4600 and faster megahertz on the memory there. On the quad channel kits though, which is really nice, X99 was kind of capped out around 3200 megahertz. That's really the fastest we could see kits that we could sell quad channel. It's a little bit faster depending.
Especially in large density.
Especially large density. If you had 64 gigs or 128 gigs of RAM, you're not going to get much faster than 3000, 3200 megahertz. Skylake X basically blows that out of the water. So in the lab, we've seen 4200, 4000 megahertz plus with a 64 gigabyte or 128 gigabyte kit. So I have no doubt that within the next month or two, as kind of BIOSes get more finalized and memory gets a little bit better performance and screening techniques, you guys will be able to buy 128 gigabyte kits, 8 modules at 4200 or faster, which is really good. I mean, it's another 1,000 megahertz. And Skylake treats memory a little bit differently, so it should actually give you some real world benefits on that, especially for guys who are doing any kind of encoding or other things like that that really are CPU intensive.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's something that you definitely don't want to overlook. When you talk about that huge increase, the reason why the increase has occurred is that Intel's essentially brought over their second generation DDR4 memory controllers. So what you saw in the previous X99 platform was the first generation DDR4 memory controller. So that's where you really saw a lot more of that limitation in terms of the frequency. And so the second generation controller, which is essentially what we've seen in Z170 and then in Z270, you can see has been really matured and stabilized to allow for much, much, much higher frequencies. And that's why you have such a massive increase in the frequencies. And to George's point, we didn't talk about it, but one of the big changes in this CPU, especially on the Skylake X side, is Intel's moved away from something called a ring bus architecture and into something that's called a mesh architecture. And there's a lot more sensitivity in terms of the way that memory works with this type of architecture. And so when he's talking about that, normally, unless you're talking about a lot of very sensitive kind of bandwidth-oriented programs, if you put in faster frequency memory, you don't generally see like a huge impact in your gaming performance. But here in terms of generalized CPU performance, it will actually improve as you scale up the frequency. So there's a bit more, I'd say, sensibility in terms of looking for higher frequency kits. So a lot of Z270 buyers, I generally tell them, hey, if you're targeting kind of that sweet spot, look for 2400, 2800. It's a really good price to performance density of memory. But here on the X299 side of the fence, I'm going to probably be telling people start trending, looking more maybe towards 32, 34, 36. Definitely, as George says, you can definitely go crazy and you can start looking at 38, 4000, 4200, which will be a possibility, but of course cost will increase. And there's also a little bit of the silicon lottery still in play when it comes to the memory controller on CPUs and how that plays out.
So just to follow up about memory, when it comes to getting a high-end memory kit, say from Corsair, and using it in an ASUS motherboard, ASUS does a ton of work with validation of memory kits. And you can go to the ASUS website, go to any motherboard you're using, and see a full list of all of the kits that have been validated. So let's say a rough expectation of people in the mid-3000s range. If you get, say, a Skylake X processor and a kit validated for an ASUS motherboard of Corsair memory, is there a pretty high confidence that you're going to be able to plug that kit in, set your XMP values, or set manually the speed and timings, and that it should just work?
Yeah, for sure. So that's a great point. So three things to that, right, is that a lot of people may not necessarily know. Hopefully these enthusiasts, you know what XMP is, but to kind of give you guys insight, in our last polling, I don't know how many, maybe by showing of hands, how many people in here, if they have XMP memory, have actually set the XMP on their system? I see. That's actually about what we've pulled. So
what would you say
it's like about a third to a half, I'd say.
Yeah, and so when we ran a really big poll on this, we actually saw that over 50% of users never set the XMP profile on their memory. So that means that they went to Newegg, they went to Amazon, they went to Fry's, they went to wherever they bought their memory. They bought this 3000 kit of memory, and they thought, I plug it in. It should just work at that speed, right?
So as a memory company, I can tell you that the number of people who call tech support saying, hey, I just found out the memory about 2 years ago is running at 1333 or whatever, 1600. Why is that? I bought 3000 or I bought 2800. It's like, well, you actually have to turn that on.
You have to turn on that.
It's like
you have to download more of it, basically.
And this car has this awesome feature that is awesome if you know it exists.
Exactly. And so to that point, one is that the memory controller plays into this. Board design plays into this. We do a lot of work on the physical design side and then on the UEFI, the BIOS side, to be able to allow for the interoperability. But to your question, in terms of how many people can see confidence, I would definitely say that when you talk about like 3200, which is the top end on X99, that's par for the course. Every Kaby Lake X or Skylake X CPU will run that, no problems. And on our end, not even just from our own QVL, if you go to even Intel's XMP website, which actually they keep their own record of every single XMP kit that is validated, we generally will beat out any other motherboard manufacturer by a factor of 2. So we, let's say, validate 200 memory modules. The closest company behind us might be at only 100 modules. So that is really important to us because when we work with a partner like Corsair, we can look at their entire portfolio from Dominator Platinum to Vengeance to whatever it might be, and users can drop it in and feel confident in that working. And to the last point in terms of turning it on, you guys have seen it in some of our boards. We try to take the effort to make it easy. If you're not an enthusiast that doesn't know to go into the UEFI to turn on the option, you might have a switch on the motherboard that you can just click on and it'll turn it on for you. or when we get into some of the auto overclocking discussion, our auto overclocking technology actually will automatically enable the XMP even for you. So if you make the investment in XMP memory, this overclockable CPU, it's pretty easy to ensure that you get that experience.
Okay, you mentioned auto overclocking, so we want to jump into that next, but I have a real quick question first. You personally, as far as your testing with this platform goes, what's the highest frequency kit that you've gotten up and running, say, on a Skylake X CPU?
In the time that I've had, I think a 4,000 kit. 4,000? So nothing too crazy. I mean, to me, I try to find that kind of sweet spot of, as much as I like super high-end systems, I try to be a balance of like an every person type of build. So I try to target what I think is an enthusiast kind of level that people want to get in at, but not necessarily something like that's so like obscene that it's like, that's a really, really small niche, right? Not to say that there aren't people that definitely kind of fall in that factor. We love those kind of elite enthusiasts that want to totally take it to the next level. But I've been impressed just alone on this backend system that we've got over in the corner, right? Yeah. Where that system auto-tuned 128 gig kit of memory at 3200, right? With was whatever the 4.5 gigahertz overclock, and I thought that was crazy to just be able to see that automatically happen, because I remember when we did a launch event for X299, and we were doing the first 64 gig kit, right? Mm-hmm. And being able to see that, so the evolution of being able to see that has been pretty cool.
I mean, back in the X79 days or whatever, getting 3,000 was a staggering.
Yeah, I mean, it was like
world record overclock.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so now we're talking about like this. It's like par for the course. It's like whatever.
Yeah. Guys are putting liquid helium on these things, and doing ridiculous stuff. So.
All right, so if you want to overclock, and that is definitely something I think you should do on this platform if you do invest in it, because every single CPU is unlocked for overclocking. They all have X's on the end, and an X is like a K when it comes to Intel processors. It means it's unlocked for overclocking. Yep. And you can get a lot of speed out of this, especially with those low-end chips, the Kaby Lake X CPUs. Monsters. They're insane for overclocking, and in my opinion, that's one of the things I think that they're best for, is breaking OC records, and I'm sure we're going to see more of that. We saw quite a bit of actually at Computex just a couple weeks ago, and I'm sure as this platform gets into the hands of more people, we're going to see more of it. Now, when it comes to overclocking, not everyone knows how to do it, so I liked your idea of a show of hands before. First off, a show of hands for everyone in here who actually overclocks whether it's a GPU, a CPU,
we got an
anything
enthusiast crowd in here.
We got quite a few. I'd say well over half.
And for those of you guys who don't, why not? Like, it's not like it costs extra. You just turn it on. Literally go in the BIOS.
Fear, complexity. They won't know when you send your broken CPU back to them.
And if you go in to turn on and enable XMP, then you reboot, now your system is faster, and it was free.
Okay.
It's easy.
So follow-up question, how many of you guys have used an automatic overclocking utility from someone like ASUS? 1, 2, 3, all right, less, still a decent amount. All right, so
how many are overclocking with a soldering iron and big switches, old school
we could go that far. We could go that far.
Hand crank.
When you had to mess with IRQ interrupted. All right, I wasn't going
old school.
We don't want to go back that far.
Breaking up the 90s.
So I have been pretty impressed with the ASUS overclocking utility for quite some time now, because there's different overclocking utilities. They work different ways. Sometimes a motherboard might just have a set of profiles and it just engages whatever profile, which may or may not work with the specific hardware that you have in there. Because like JJ was saying earlier, when it comes to a CPU, the memory controller in the CPU might be a little different from motherboard to motherboard. It's always, and from CPU to CPU, it's always going to work at that base frequency that Intel says it will work at. And that's why when you plug everything, the SPD, it's going to work at that frequency. But going beyond that, it can be hit or miss depending on how high the frequency goes. The ASUS motherboards overclock in an automatic fashion. Is this available? First off, JJ, let's give a quick overview of how that works. And is this available across the entire lineup on X299, or are we only specific boards?
We've brought it to the largest number of boards that we've had. So, if we go over, we can do just a quick visual tour. So I'm going to hold up one of our Prime Series boards. So this right here, this is the X299 Deluxe, but we also have it in an entry version, which will be the X299-A. Both the Prime Series boards at launch have full support for what we'll be demoing and talking about, which is our auto-tuning technology, which is part of our 5-way optimization suite. The Tough Series historically has not offered automatic overclocking. We offer full extensive manual overclocking in the UEFI, but for this generation, we have implemented a basic version of our auto overclocking technology. Okay. It won't be the exact version that we'll show you here, but there is an offering for users that at least want to be able to kind of take advantage of that overclocking nature that's built into all the CPUs. And Kyle's got over there the Strix. The Strix series is our entry into kind of our very, very gaming-oriented series of motherboards. And the Strix series will have the auto overclocking technology exactly like the Prime series do. And the upcoming ROG motherboards, formal ROG boards like our Apex or like the Extreme, as well as even our WS model, those will also feature auto overclocking. So pretty much for the most part, every board will have that technology. Now, before we get into, I think, some of the specifics on the overclocking, I think one of the things that's really important, and there's not a lot of discussion on this in general, Intel has done some really amazing things in terms of enabling overclocking options for enthusiasts. So when we talk about the actual CPU right now, I don't know how many of you in here are familiar with it, but right now there's 3 different types of voltages that can be provided to your, essentially your CPU. And Intel has taken this to even a higher level in terms of the granularity control for Skylake X. So historically we've had something that's called a manual vid, and then an evolution of that, something was called an offset bit, and then the most advanced version was called an adaptive vid. And the reason why this is important is that overclocking is pretty much taking something running at one frequency and forcing it to go to a higher frequency, right? And so usually the way you do that is you would give it more voltage. So you would increase that. So if, let's say I want to go from like 3.5 to 4 gigahertz, I'd set it to go 4 gigahertz and I'd give it more voltage. The disadvantage of that manual option is that it would keep the voltage consistent. It would always stay all the way up here. It means it would never come down. So that means you consumed more power, you would produce more heat, and you can even cause what maybe some of you get fear about in terms of overclocking, which is called degradation. It's literally always feeding a lot of this voltage. It's kind of like if, you know, the analogy of putting like heat next to like plastic or something, right? It's going to melt it over time, right? That's not realistically going to happen to your CPU, but it can degrade it. It can cause maybe like after a year and a half, 2 years, maybe that CPU that was running at 4, it's only going to run at 3.9, right? So there was more advanced. Then you got something that was called an offset, which was kind of like this intermediate option of somewhat providing more voltage, but only in conditional parameters. But adaptive, which recently came in from Intel's architecture, is where this has absolutely been game-changing. What this allows you to do is get the best of both worlds. It keeps the voltage 100% in stock frequency when the CPU is operating in its normal range. So if, let's say, the CPU operates up to 4 gigahertz normally, it won't adjust the voltage. It won't increase it, right? So it comes down, it comes up exactly the way Intel defines it. But when we go to a higher frequency, that's only at that time does the voltage increase. So that gives you really the best balance of efficiency, maintaining long lifespan, reducing power consumption, and thermals. And I think that's the really cool part. I've dropped a lot of information just in that little bit that I've talked about there. And for most users, they have no idea any of those options
lost
exist.
track like about 10 minutes
Yeah.
ago.
They don't
So
know.
out of character is EJJ.
They don't know any of those options exist, what to do with those options. And I think that's really the value of what we've done is that when we designed the auto tuning technology, we've taken literally tens of thousands of man hours, people hours, because we have women engineers as well, on our teams, and distilled it down into something that automatically occurs. So we've actually got a little video here that we can show you that actually gives you, it's our auto tuning video, which will show you some of the UI interface. And so what you're seeing actually within this are some of the preset options that we have available that allow you to customize this. So while this is software executed, this is all actually in a full combination experience on software that you're executing in an easy interface, so you don't have to go into the UEFI, but it's talking directly to the motherboard. This happens on a firmware level. So literally, if the user themselves was inside the BIOS, these changes all happen in real time. In fact, once this is all done, if you even uninstall the software, the settings don't disappear because they've literally been programmed just like a user did them.
That's actually one of my favorite things about this. is that
So
it'll
for
plug
people
it
that
in.
quote unquote hate software, this is great because literally it is just an ends than means to execute the options. And some of these things that you're seeing on sliders, they allow for really great levels of granularity. You can target voltage. So maybe you hear people say, oh, don't go over 1.325. You can target the overclock based on that voltage. Put that in and we'll overclock to whatever the CPU can do within that voltage. We can target temperature. If you want to go up to 80 C, right, for your temperature, target that. Or if you want to target frequency, you don't know if your CPU can do 4.6, but you can just set 4.6 and we'll get you to whatever that might be. And the reason why this is really important is that every CPU varies. There's something that's called the silicon lottery. It means that while they're all overclockable CPUs, there's no way to know whether one CPU does 4.3 or 4.4, 4.6. On an average, we actually know that most of these CPUs for Skylake X actually and Kaby X actually overclock quite well. you're talking probably on average 500 to 800 megahertz overclocking range on most of these CPUs. But you also don't know what cooler. Did you get, an H80?
Yep.
Did you get an H100? Did you get an H15?
Yeah,
right?
and Skylake and the Kaby Lake X both run really, really hot. So for those of you guys who haven't played with them at all, I know you guys have a little bit. I saw your thing, Paul, too.
Dabbled, yes.
Yeah, it's a hot processor. It's not a cool processor. This thing generates a lot of heat, a lot more than last gen, the Broadwell E stuff. So, I mean, entry-level CPU cooling on this, I would say at least a 240 millimeter all-in-one cooler, or 280 preferably. Something really decent on that. If you're going to go air cooling, get something huge, like something monstrous. I would advise against air cooling this thing, but you're not going to believe what I say anyway because we sell liquid coolers. But I would advise seriously to get a big all-in-one, like a 280 or a 240, like the 115i or the 110i.
And that's the cool thing. Sorry, to that point is that when you run this whole utility, whatever your thermal solution is, it's accounting for that. So if, like, let's say you start off with something like a, even an H80i, right? And then you shift over into a higher end part, maybe, tax return time comes, you're like, dude, I can drop in a better cooler, rerun the utility. You actually might get a higher result because you actually now have a better cooling solution. So it's CPU and system and cooling specific. And I will also note that even some of you guys have seen some of the initial reviews that come out there, while definitely the power draw on this system is high. We're not talking about entry level in any respect when it comes to power consumption and for thermals. One thing that I have seen is that some of the reviews and some of the content that's focusing out there is focusing on the heat being produced under pure synthetic workloads and with these manual voltages. I've actually run tests at 4.6 gigahertz with the 240 millimeter actually closed loop cooling solution that under normal game loads, even in the hot ambient summer that right now we're having, I was seeing, by peak temperature was up to about 80 C. So when you look at some of the reviews, they might be like, oh, it was breaching at like 100 degrees already. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody that actually is building their system to play Prime 95. If you are, let me know. I'd love to really find out what that
I'm getting good.
Yeah, what that experience is like in terms of why you might be doing that. But we're building our systems to play games, to be able to surf the internet, to watch videos, and in that respect, using these new functions and features that Intel's provided that we're implementing actually allow you to really still get a great experience with a wide range of cooling solutions. I agree to George's point. I wouldn't go with probably anything below like an H80 in terms of a cooling unit, but I do even feel with that you can still get a very good quality overclock experience. And the bigger you go, you're just giving yourself more breathing room to overclock higher and also keep your system quieter.
That's the other thing is when you talk about practical application of it, like people want their systems to be quiet. Some people care deeply about that, right? And some people are, I don't want windows, I don't want lights, I don't want anything. I just want a black box that lives under my desk and I can forget about. And it never makes noise, and it just does what I tell it to do. Yep. And some people feel that way, and that's cool. But yeah, if you buy like an H115 and you overclock with it, the benefit of that is that you're going to be able to run it, the fans are going to be able to run at 40% or 50%, so you won't have to have them screaming in order to cool this thing down. There's a lot of real risk when it comes to overheating a processor, especially something that's standard 120 watts plus TDP, and it can go up to 200 when you overclock it and overvolt it. So, I mean, this is something that, we're talking a graphics card worth of heat. In this little tiny thing, and even if you delid this, like a lot of these guys that have done the delidding, like a couple of these pro overclockers have taken the lid off it, the heat spreader off it, taken the TIM off it, and then they put the thing on. They only see like an 8 to 10 degree drop, which is completely different. Last gen, 2 gens ago, you'd see 20 degrees, 25 degrees. So there's all these people out there saying, well, if Intel had soldered it again instead of using the TIM or whatever. But that actually doesn't make that big a difference this time. It's not a huge deal. Like, this is a really hot processor. You've got to cool this thing. I don't know if I've said that enough yet. Just everyone should know.
Yeah, I was going to mention really quick that the Kaby Lake X sample that I got was a 7740X, and it actually came delidded. And I was expecting it to just like be super chilly, and still it got up to like maybe 65, 66 degrees Celsius, overclocked to 5.3
But that's what
gigahertz.
I'm saying, exactly.
But that's also thanks to the H110i that was on it. Doing a fantastic job of cooling it as well.
Yeah, if you put a standard, like a really big air cooler on it, you'd have been 20 degrees hotter.
Exactly.
And now that's, okay, thermal shutdown is 95 or whatever, so you're not going to hit thermal shutdown. Right. But the fans will be louder, you're going to be putting more stress on it, generating more heat for the inside of the system instead of exhausting it out. So.
Right.
And Darren from YouTube chat also pointed out, perhaps was watching some of the Computex coverage. I hear rumors that there's maybe a 360 rad version of the Corsair Hydro
We are
series.
working on a 360. We showed it at Computex this year. So for those of you guys who would rather have 3 120mm fans instead of 2 140s, we'll have that available pretty quick here in the next few months.
Cool.
So we showed a concept of it. We're working on it in the labs. The right thing right now is to kind of get that balance of noise performance ratio. So our main goal with this generation is to get everything quieter. So you'll see a lot quieter liquid coolers coming in the near future, I think.
Those have
Nice.
hydrodynamic bearing fans too, right?
They do. They will have the ML series, magnetic levitation, not
Oh,
hydrodynamic.
maglev.
Maglev.
Yeah.
Magnetic levitation. We use magnets. We found out how they work. Something we did.
Excellent.
I will point once again, a lot of times in the reviews, you guys aren't seeing a lot of the more kind of nuts and bolts things that are being put into the architecture and that we spend a lot of time to put in our motherboards. And this is where there are differences, because not every reviewer is going to cover like all the options that are inside the UEFI. Intel is giving you the ability to target what's called CPU thermal junction points. We can actually go into the UEFI and you can set a breach throttle point of like 90 degrees. So if you're comfortable allowing the CPU to get to that point, you can essentially have the CPU sustain operating at a certain frequency. There's levels of controls that have really been now implemented that are better than I've ever seen in any generation. And a lot of this is because they've worked really closely to listen to the feedback that we've given to say, give us the knobs and switches to really be able to dial this in. There's even something that's really cool. If you want to hammer your system, you want to stress test it, well, whatever, with your Prime 95, with your Limp Pack, do it. But there's other really cool option that's called an actual AVX offset. There's no game on the market that uses something that's called AVX. One of the coolest things about these new generation processors is actually AVX support. Now that's existed for multiple generations. These new Skylake CPUs have AVX 512, which could be in the coming year, maybe 2 years, an absolute game changer in performance. You could see factors of 150, 200% greater performance in some applications if they're coded natively for that when they come out. But synthetic stress tests like Prime 95 or something like that use these things, but games don't. And so when you stress your CPU, you could find that you get it much hotter or that it's not stable at that load. So we actually have an option that you can go in and select that the actual overclock drops when it has an actual AVX instruction. So that means you could overclock your system to like 5.2 gigahertz for gaming, right? But the moment that an AVX instruction set comes in, we can downclock it to like 4.8 if you want, so that you make sure that it's always stable regardless of the environment. So that's where, again, like I said, when you're making the investment in a board like what we put into any one of these boards, regardless if we're talking our entry-level board to our highest end board, all these options are there. There's a lot of ways to really be able to maximize the experience that you have for both Kaby Lake X and Skylake X.
So speaking of ways to maximize the experience, there's different ways to maximize the experience. You can go into the UEFI and play around with everything there, or you can use the ASUS software to play around with everything there. One of the things you've already sort of highlighted with the demo that we had of the automatic overclocking utility was that they actually tie in together. But what are some of the options that are available across both of them that might make people who are more comfortable using one or the other still be able to get done what they need done?
I think the great part is that when it comes to those tuning parameters, they're all essentially the same. Everything that you guys saw in the little overview there. If we go to the easy mode screen, take for instance in a UEFI screenshot that we have here, we have a basic foundation that allow everybody to adjust the basic parameters of their system in terms of kind of basic clock speed, easily enable the XMP for their memory. But if they go into the advanced section, then of course they can adjust all these different things. Now, one of the unique things that exists within the UEFI that you don't yet get in the advanced operating system environment within auto tuning is going to be something that's new to Intel's Skylake X, which is per core tuning and even per core voltage. That literally means that Intel is giving you the ability to set the voltage and the multiplier per each core. This is pretty crazy because most of us run different types of workload experiences. Your browser, take for instance, a lot of time uses like 1 or 2 threads. You jump into Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1's actually pretty well multi-threaded. It can actually use up to sometimes about 8 threads in terms of its balancing. You jump into like Total Warhammer. Total Warhammer actually loves threads. You can scale up to even an Extreme Edition CPU and it will actually get better performance the more cores you give to it. Because a lot of the AI that's happening within that game dynamic, because it's a huge monster kind of RTS kind of gameplay experience. So there is merit to kind of being able to tailor your system in that regard. So that is something that you have exclusive within the UEFI that we haven't yet ported in. But in the auto tuning, you still get per core tuning and all core tuning. So depending on how you want to set up your system, you can do both. And I think one thing that I'm also a big fan of that it's not to your tuning point, but I know a lot of people always have questions about is flashing the BIOS or flashing the UEFI. A recent update that we had on Z270 and second generation X99 that's on all these boards is we give you a lot of different ways to update the UEFI. So most people know like, oh, I download it to a flash drive, I plug it into the port, I go into like Easy Flash and I update. We were the first company, and we have it on a lot of these boards where we have a USB BIOS flashback option, which means that if you plug in a flash drive, even if you don't have the CPU, the memory, or the graphics card installed, you can just plug it into a port and you hold down this button. It can directly update the motherboard directly. So that's really nice for system builders when you first set up your system. I go, I just want to be up to date. I want to have everything ready because it'll help to make sure that you got the best stability, reliability, and performance. Yeah. That's a really cool feature.
It's actually one of those things that is, like if you've ever built like a number of systems like we have, there's back in the day when you'd buy a motherboard and you buy a new processor, like, oh, I don't know, Sandy Bridge came out or something like that. And you realize that you bought the processor that the motherboard was made like 6 months before and didn't have the right BIOS for that processor. So you'd put the processor in, it would try and boot,
yeah.
It'd be like, no.
Chicken before the egg, right? Yeah, exactly.
And then like, oh, you got to update your BIOS before that processor will work. I'm like, well, how do I do that? Well, you put a processor in, and then you update the BIOS. Like, so I got to go buy another processor, or I got to get a friend that has like, hey man, can I borrow the processor from your gaming rig for 10 minutes? Like, it's just a giant pain. So that feature is really cool that a lot of people don't realize they'll need it until suddenly they need it, and then it's an awesome feature, especially for a platform like this. It's going to live for
a very
years.
long time. Yeah.
So
And even where we know there's more CPUs coming down the pipe. But the new one that I really love is that we have now integrated UEFI updating. So it's built in. So as long as you connect your Ethernet cable, so install everything, but without needing to get into Windows, you go to the update option, and it's just like kind of if you were updating firmware on your phone or your tablet or some type of smart device, right? Now you just expect I can click an update button, it connects and says, hey, is there an update, and it downloads it. So now the motherboard has this also built in. So you can just update, go to Easy Flash 3 and connect internet as opposed to a USB drive, and that way you don't have to run in that situation because, still to download something, well, you don't have Windows on that system. So where do you download it from? It means that you need still another system. Right? But what happens if this is your first system? You might not have a way to download the update. So now here, at least as long as you have that active internet pipeline, connect the Ethernet cable, go into the UEFI, and you can download that update. So I think that's a really cool option.
Yep.
Excellent. All right, let's talk looking to the future just a little bit. Right now we've at least seen reviews on this up to the 7900X processor, which is a 10-core, but there's promised CPUs beyond that, 12-core, 14-core, 16-core, and even 18-core, which should be launching towards the later half of this year. I believe August through October is when we're expecting those chips. Are there any concerns? We'll start with from the Corsair side. Are there any concerns as far as the TDP or the amount of power draw from those chips?
Sure. Yeah, that's a huge concern. So X299 platform is very power hungry. The more cores, generally when you overclock those things, it doesn't scale kind of perfectly linearly. It's not like, oh, I have a 10% overclock, I'm going to use 10% more TDP.
Yep.
It's actually kind of a hockey stick, right? So it gets to that point where, like with car guys, they'll tell you to go from 200 miles per hour to 210 miles per hour requires 300 extra horsepower, to get that last 10 miles per hour. That's like with CPU cooling is the same thing. Once you've gotten to like 85 degrees or 90 degrees on that thing, if you're not cooling it down, then you're not efficiently going to be able to get much past that. So I think that when you get more and more cores in there, you see that heat generate much faster. So a 6-core, 8-core, when you overclock it, you're going to get a certain amount of heat, wattage generated there. When you do that with a 16-core and 18-core, you're going to see a lot more. And I think that that's something we have to think about. We haven't tested them, obviously. The 18-core, we haven't seen it in the lab yet. I know that Intel's playing around with that still. But we have seen the 10-core. And like the 6950X from last gen was pretty monstrous, too. Like when you tried to overclock that, go look up what the world record guys had to do for that stuff when they try and set the world record for that platform. These liquid helium stuff and all new pot designs and things like that. So it's a giant pain. You have to think about it. I would say that for a power supply standpoint, if you're going to do serious overclocking on a high-end 12-core or higher, like you got to plan for 200 to 250 watts minimum if you want to eliminate the power supply from your concerns, right? So that's just for the CPU alone, not the motherboard, not the RAM, not the video card. If you're going to do that with, I don't know, let's say a NVIDIA card or a high-end like a 1080 Ti or something like that, so another 200-something watts, depending if you overclock that. You could really be talking like a minimum of a 750, 850 watt power supply just for safety purposes and just say, hey, look, I want to make sure that my power supply is never going to be my bottleneck, I would recommend at least that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think 850 definitely to that 1,000-watt target is you're right on the money. But I think that also gets to the point that I was talking about where using the architecture that's at play, being efficient with the overclocking, is going to help to maximize the stability. And actually something that George didn't talk about that ties into power supplies is that they've done a great job that their platforms are actually designed for something that are called certain C states. So a lot of people, they bring over power supplies from old builds to kind of new systems, and they don't realize that power supplies can degrade over time, their performance. So their wattage kind of envelope kind of compresses down a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. When you go to a really high current platform like this that can go from this level of kind of consumption and then go all the way up to this level of consumption, you want your power supply to really be strong performing. And also, there are certain what are called C states. So these are the way that the CPU kind of drops down in terms of
sleep or hibernation.
Exactly, sleep or hibernation. And you want your actually power supply to be optimally designed for these new sleep states. So Windows and also the CPU have been designed for these latest generation. They're called C6, C7. There's even deeper sleep states than this. And we've designed all our hardware to match up with the latest generation power supplies to work with those latest CPUs. And you'd be surprised how many troubleshooting things that we run into users that don't account for this. They think, I've got this really great PSU that I bought 3.5 years ago, but it might not be rated for the latest C-State operation, and they run into issues with sleep or hibernation.
Exactly.
And it's because they're not having that optimal pairing. So
yeah, that's actually true. There's a lot of people that think that, oh, I have an ATX compatible power supply, it has all the right connectors, therefore I'm good, right? And yeah, it'll actually physically work. But a number of, like you're saying, a number of troubleshooting steps is go in the BIOS and turn off C6, or go in the BIOS and turn off C7.
Yep.
Oh wow, I don't have that problem anymore. That's amazing.
And it's because the power supply can't drop down to that level and hold it and then swing back up.
Yeah.
So these are really kind of subtle, goofy things that they get into technical, quote unquote, minutia, but this is where it kind of can be sensible that if you're bringing probably something that's more than 3.5, 4 years old, and you're bringing it over to a new build, probably reconsider that,
or at least know that that feature will not be available.
Exactly, or you might have to do some more tinkering to get kind of that optimal experience from your system. I will note that one thing too, also from a cooling design and even going into your chassis, when we talk about these really high-end CPU platforms, we've worked really, really hard on the power delivery design. So when you talk about the systems, people sometimes talk about phases. I won't really worry about the total quantity because it's not about the quantity, more so it's the quality of the design. So all the boards will actually overclock to about the same. So then people ask, well, what's the difference if I buy like the higher end deluxe board versus like the prime board? So George, if you can hold the prime dash A versus the.
Can I
Do I have
hold
the
Give it the deluxe.
Oh yeah, well versus like I mean any of these other boards, like here I'll do the Tough Take for instance. You can hold the Tough. We put like an assist fan here that'll give active airflow to this area. So what the difference might be is it's kind of like going to a bigger cooler, going from an H80i to like an H110. The overclocking margin actually might be the same between both cooling solutions, but one that has more mass and can cool more will keep the temperature lower, and so that can help. This also actually plays even a little bit into chassis. Chassis that have more top airflow that can provide down airflow, instead of actually going with normal exhaust, a lot of us always go exhaust for our fans on the top, you actually can find that in X299 and in now this platform actually turning it inverse, having airflow come down and blow directly across this, and even your DIMMs.
Yeah, so we designed a case specifically for this purpose that nobody liked for some reason. It's an awesome case. I highly recommend all of you guys that want really good CPU overclocking, go buy a 600C right now. They're amazing. And I'm not just saying that because I was the case designer, but that's part of it. But realistically, it was an inverse ATX, right? So it was, you flip the motherboard over, and the front and bottom were right on the CPU and motherboard and GPUs, and the top was a power supply and an optical drive chamber up there for cables. So it actually worked really well. It was, the people complain, oh, the window's on the right side now. I have to reorganize my whole desk. But actually, the biggest complaint, the biggest reason people didn't like it was the GeForce GTX on my graphics card is upside down now. Like when I put my new graphics card in that I just spent $700 on, that light green GeForce GTX, I have to go like that to read it. And that was their complaint. And I'm like, yeah, but your overclocking is like 18% better, and your performance thermally is like 12 degrees cooler, and it's quieter, and literally everything is better. And like, yeah, but the letters are upside down.
And there was no RGB. What the heck?
So if you're willing to tolerate the letters being upside down, then that case is good for you. It's good for everybody. But
you guys got, I mean, there's tons of other choices you guys have that still have really good
there's
airflow.
a lot of Air 540.
It's
there's
just
a bunch of other great
it's just
cases.
thinking about that there are different ways to play into it. But I think the aesthetic choice that also, I mean, we didn't talk about aesthetics. I mean, I know for me, I know for you guys, I care about the way my motherboard looks. We've spent a huge amount of time on the way that kind of the board design works, and we've got a lot of really great looking builds in here, and I think it's because all of us have taken now the time and effort to really design boards that look great and give you guys aesthetic choice.
What's this action here? This little LCD?
This is cool. This is new for our Deluxe, is that it's an integrated OLED display, so you can see real-time information like, you know, voltages, temperatures. You can customize it with your own little logo. You can put different information, or even useful-wise, there's a built-in postcode reader. So
nice.
on a lot of boards, you'll get like a debug code. Maybe you want to show
It
them
won't
the
be
debug
like an AO. And
Yeah,
like, what
so-
is AO? And you like Google it, and you're like,
Yeah, so most
Memory
people
error.
never read the manual, sadly, right? But they look at the debug code, and it's like 55. I don't know what 55 means, but now you can turn it into what's called string, and you can actually see, oh, memory initialization or GPU initialization. So it helps you kind of know that. But I think one of the really cool things that I love is that they're essentially all monochromatic, right? You know, the Strix, the Tough series, and then we have white. There's no color contention here, right?
but there is that reasoning because now they're all RGB, right?
Exactly. So, you know,
So-
all the boards have some form of integrated lighting, with multiple of them having RGB headers, as well as on X99 boards we have new addressable RGB header, and of course that's great because that gives you a lot of synchronization and control to be able to pair up with, you know, graphics cards and a wide number of other devices. So I think it gives people that, you know, from our polling, 50% of people get influenced by how something looks. You know, I don't know what you guys think about, but it is the truth. You know, it's not just the spec and the performance
I
and
think the other
reliability.
50% are lying.
Yeah.
I think
Well-
if you said like, I don't care what my hardware looks like, but then it was like, dude, if it was pink and it had like Hello Kitty all over it, you're gonna either have a 10% that like love that and want to buy it,
Right.
or 90% that's like, I'm not putting that in my case. Dude.
Or I mean, or it's like, you know, like you've done some interesting builds, Kyle, you know, where you've done like pink and purple, right? As far as, well, I'm talking about just color palette, right? That's not going to float everybody, but the last thing you want to have is fixed colors that work against your choice to be able to fix that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's our goal, has been to make sure that whatever you want to set for your build, you have the choice and the flexibility to make it look and feel how you want.
Yeah,
And
I really
that-
like the Prime series you guys did because white reflects any lighting you choose to do,
Yeah.
right? So we do a lot of RGB stuff, obviously, and you've seen that RGB stuff is like, oh, we have the demo pictures in rainbow mode and everything. That's not how most people actually set up
They
their
go with
RGB.
like single accent color,
Yeah.
like the blue
They
system.
pick
that
a
we got
blue
there, yeah.
system, and then 6 months later, they're like, oh, I'm tired of blue, I'm going to change to red or whatever. And they do that, and they change it, and on the fly, instead of having to go buy all new everything, right? So it's nice that way. I think it's better in that respect.
Yeah.
But the white, I really like the white accents because it just reflects whatever the lighting in your system is at that moment. So
For sure.
it's a cool feature.
One of the things I like doing with the Aura software, the ASUS Aura software for controlling RGB, is it has a color wheel option, and you can narrow down an area of the color wheel. So with all the lights synced in the case, I just chose a slice of that color wheel. So I did like a springtime theme with green, yellow, and blue. And
Yeah.
it just, so you still get a little bit of RGBness going through there without having the rainbow vomit everywhere. And I found that to be a
The
nice
rainbow
sort of
vomit is the
in-between.
one of our most popular profiles.
The
Actually.
Corsair Rainbow Vomit.
Well,
option.
I think it's like
You
the
go to the
demo
RGB
one.
share
It's the
profile.
demo one, right? It's like when you
Yeah.
bring a friend
Well,
over. It's like, do
that's
you
how
want?
you tell them.
Yeah.
It's so
This
the
is
problem-
RGB.
This is a stupid marketing problem that you guys are so bored by. But like, really, it's like, hey, how do I take a picture of something and tell them it's RGB? Well, it has to show the whole rainbow. Otherwise, it's just one color, right? Like, or I got to show 19 colors to show it's red, it's green, it's pink, it's yellow, it's
Right.
orange. Like, so you show them the rainbow mode, and then some guy on YouTube goes, I hate RGB. And it's like, dude, just, it's not RGB all the time. It's not mandatory RGB.
Exactly. And,
Like-
and so like we just cut to the two systems that we have back there. We had one
Yeah.
green system and one blue system. I mean, that's the way that I look at it. I just think that for us, our goal has just been about giving you ultimately aesthetic choice, right? You have the flexibility being able to go in there and set it up how you want. You want a little bit of undertone, you want a little bit ambient feel, you want some accent lighting, you get to play around with it. And we're working more and more on also adding elements of even usability. So like in Aura, you have temperature mapping, right? So if you want to set your color lighting based on temperature, the colors will change based on the temperature. We've now also released an Aura API, which we're really excited about because that means that we can directly have our API built into game logic, into other applications, IoT, and lots of other things that you're going to be seeing in the future from us. And that's cool because that means that the lighting can all be tied into that, right? You know, you could be playing Witcher 3 and your lighting could even be tied into, you know, the health stats, right? Even imagine like for our next generation monitors that have Aura built into them, right? You'll get that directly tied in and you could set that individually. So we're looking at it and not just as a way of adding aesthetic, but also hopefully adding value to you on how you reference your system.
Should we start taking some questions from people?
I think so, yes.
Yes, so-
Paul, you've been very greedy, hogging JJ and George
Sorry.
all to yourself.
My bad.
So we are going to go ahead and open up some questions to the audience. Let's go ahead and cut over to Adam.
Adam has a question. Do you have anybody back there yet? Not yet.
We will be
Let's
right
see.
back
Okay.
after some short
We had
messages
to
from our
take a
sponsors.
short intermission.
Short intermission.
Thank you.
From the shortest intermission ever, and we are now ready to take some questions from the audience. I know you guys have been listening very attentively and already have some amazing questions lined up. Raise your hand if you've got one for our panel of smart people here. Anybody? Anybody got a question? You in the back. Project.
Hey, so what kind of speeds are you guys seeing on the 7800X, the 6-port plus?
On the
In terms of overclocking?
Overclocking, yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually very
Just to repeat the question. It's,
Oh, yeah. What
what are
type
the-
of over...
You go ahead. You already had it.
No.
What kind of frequency can you hit on a 7800 or 7800X?
Yeah. So in terms of the overclocking margin, I would say that it's a pretty consistent part that probably about 75% of the CPUs will comfortably be seeing about a 4.5 to about a 4.7 gigahertz clock speed. And I'd say about a 25% ratio with using some form of per-core tuning, so meaning some of the threads, not all of the threads, could even go beyond that in terms of like 4.8, maybe even 4.9. And that's, I'd say, in or around that ballpark. It's definitely, I'd say, quite a bit better than what you saw within the previous generation. On average, I would probably put it in about 300 to 400 megahertz more in terms of the overall overclocking capability. And there have even been, I'd say, probably a smaller percentage that we've even seen get higher than that in terms of that 4.8 to even almost that 5 gigahertz marker. But I think the key part there is, like we talked about, intelligent overclocking to be able to reach those numbers and not have the thermals or the powers be totally hammering you.
Yeah, if you get a good chip, if you get lucky and you have a really good cooling setup, you could probably hit 5. But that would be dependent on getting a really good chip. So I think that from what I've seen so far, I've only seen a couple of benchmarks and reviews. So until 200 guys are buying these things over the next few weeks, and we start seeing posts on overclock.net or hardwarebot or whatever, we're not really going to see any real numbers to know that. But seeing 5 doesn't seem unreasonable if you got a really good chip and good cooling.
Yeah, I mean, we just got a pretty large assortment. I mean, usually to give you guys some insight in how we look at performance overclocking and even that auto-tuning demonstration we did, we test actually quite a number of CPUs, literally, probably by the time we get close to the launch, hundreds collectively to be able to kind of find out that effective range. And right now we've just looked at the last batch, and we actually see that the good thing is the normal trend. Actually, retail CPUs are looking to even be better overclockers than what we saw with engineering samples. That isn't always the case. Sometimes engineering samples overclock better for certain reasons than retail samples. So we actually see the trend actually being a bit higher. So I think it's really great. You'll get great memory overclocking and great CPU overclocking. If you're looking for that 7820X switch, price to performance, that's going to be, I think, a really interesting part. I think a lot of people are going to like that part.
Yeah, and I think that it's also important to realize it's not just frequency, right? It's instructions per clock, which is really the issue. So, if you had a 4.7 gigahertz Broadwell and a 4.7 gigahertz Sandy Bridge X, it's not going to be the same exact performance. You're going to have to compare how it works in the things you care about. So whether it's gaming or encoding or just unzipping RAR files for an hour, whatever it is, you're going to have to compare that.
Right, but to that point, that's also where Intel's done a lot of work. The Turbo 3.0 technology is really helped to set the parity, because before, you could easily always have like the mainstream enthusiast chipset really was always better in terms of single-threaded performance. But the great thing is the way that they've now redesigned things, we're getting essentially parity to single-thread, but all the benefits, of course, multi-thread performance within that.
Okay, good answers, guys. I have a quick question from YouTube chat, and this is from the ASUS YouTube viewers. Mark asks, any details about Rampage 6 Extreme? And just to clarify, JJ talked about the 5 lineups of ASUS motherboards. Rampage is typically the name of the ASUS high-end desktop option, the ROG series, And they're usually really crazy over-the-top boards. So the Extreme is usually the highest end, and then there's sometimes a Formula, and then a Hero.
Not usually for the
top- okay.
that high-end, super high-end platform in terms of like X99, X79. We have sometimes had a Formula. Usually Extreme is always going to be filled in there. But for this generation, we will have an Apex and we will have an Extreme for sure. Whether or not we will expand to other ones, no. I can't give you much more information than what already was shown at Computex. But I will say, like always, if you are looking for the cream of the crop when it comes to, I think, aesthetics, performance, and design, that Extreme board I think is possibly maybe the best looking board that we've ever done. Which I think we've made some really great looking boards. So that's
better than the Sabertooth Z77.
I think it's better than any board. The finish, we used an actually brand new finishing process that allows you to actually have essentially this kind of refraction and mirror-like effect with the lighting, and I think it just looks amazing that you'll see on that series board. But that'll be coming in about like a month and a half time in terms of the ROG series.
How about the Impact?
For those of you guys who don't know, the Impact is the small board.
That's our mini ITX. But it'll be interesting. I'm sure we'll have people that ask. We had a lot of people that wanted us to do a Gene again, which we had for X79.
I would love to see a Gene on X299.
And we didn't do a Gene for X99, but we had a workstation micro ATX board that a lot of people liked. And so you never know. Depending on people's interests, we may revisit that. And it might make more sense because also you have even a wider range of CPUs. So that might be something that we'll bring back to the table.
I want a Gene with like a ton of M.2 and U.2 that takes the place of the PCI Express slots.
Yep. Speaking of M.2, I think that's a really good point. That's one of the really interesting things about this platform is, a lot of people are now shifting over to putting M.2 on boards. So for those of you that are not aware, Kyle, you can show right there. Of course, all the boards will pretty much have 2 M.2 slots. But one of the things that ASUS has worked really hard on our series of boards is optimal positioning for M.2. So I think we actually got a slide here that we can give you guys a little bit of insight there. But a lot of times when you look at a motherboard, some vendors will put the M.2 directly underneath kind of the CPU slot, or they might put it directly underneath the graphics card. The disadvantage that you have with that, if you think about it, is those are the 2 hottest running parts of the entire motherboard. When you're looking at really high performance M.2 SSDs, is that when you add heat to them, it's just like GPUs or CPUs, the performance drops. And so that's actually what you see in this slide, is that the performance actually comes down. And so what ASUS has had to do is that it's not the easy way, it's actually the much harder way to do this from a design standpoint, because you can see the board is packed. Where do we figure out to position the boards? So you can see there, again on the Strix, we have one which is common on a couple of boards. We have a vertical mount. So that allows the drive to be thermally isolated. If we cut away to like our demo system that we had there in the back, a lot of systems have front intake airflow. So that's great because you get all that cool air coming right across the vertically installed M.2 drive. So you can see there in those chassis, right, they've got 3 front intake airflow fans, right? So that's great because that vertically installed drive gets all that nice cool air brushing directly along it. So it's thermally isolated. Another option is on many of our boards in the bottom area down here. There's another, I believe, M.2 slide that we have here that shows a heatsink option. And this will actually show you that on our boards we have a secondary area that actually has a full aluminum heatsink. So this isn't like what you might have seen from maybe some other companies where it's just like a little cover or plate. It's a full metal plate that actually has thermal interface material that makes contact with that to be able to dissipate the heat. So here you can see on the Strix board, that's an example of that. And so that helps us, that depending on the board, we have different ones with different solutions, is anywhere between like 15 to as much as 20 degrees reduction in temperature to be able to maintain the performance. We also on our boards have generally an M.2 assist fan header. So if you want a 3D print your own like little header, put like a little 40mm fan, it can even monitor the thermal temperature of the drive. And so the moment that drive gets to a certain temperature, we can have the fan kick on to even give further cooling performance.
Yeah. Heat is something that people who do M.2 drives don't really think that much about. I mean, they didn't, at least for the first couple of years, we didn't see a lot of it.
Well, the faster and faster that they're going now. I mean, even, with the drives you guys are making, you're getting to a performance point. If you make the investment in it, you really want to make sure that you're getting the performance out of it.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive. A lot of people is like, oh, it's just flash memory, right? And that doesn't get that hot. And it's like, well, yeah, it does when it's running this kind of speed and you're using it for literally everything. Like, I mean, there's even external USB drives we make that have basically SSD drives in the little USB enclosure. And we make those out of aluminum because the entire housing is a heatsink then, right? But if you throw that on there and copy 60 gigs of files over, that you've completely legally downloaded from the internet, then it's going to be warm, It's going to be something that you're like, wow, I just spent, 12 minutes transferring data back and forth, and now this drive is physically warm. So.
Well, I mean, you guys even see this in memory. I mean, you guys, like your highest end, generally Dominator kits came bundled with fans. Why? Because when the memory ICs actually get too hot, if you keep them more at a regulated temperature, it's the same even with CPUs. The cooler temperature you can, it actually maintains better stability for them in the long term, especially if you're heavily loading them.
Yeah, and it changes. I mean, the change is pretty significant between different types of controllers, different types of flash. Are you using MLC or TLC, or what kind of flash NAND are you actually using on the device? How's the controller accessing it? All that stuff affects the temperature too. So, and then that even then when it hits its kind of throttling temp, how bad does it hit the well? How bad does it drop when it hits that? Because some of them just like, okay, we're just going to choke performance a little bit to stay right under that throttling thing. Others have like a hard safe number that's like, okay, until we get to 65 degrees C, we're just cutting performance by 50%.
Yeah, I mean, you could see in the slide we showed you there, I mean, the drop in performance, I think, was in excess of like 30%. So it's a substantial drop. So, I mean, I think the cool thing is that even like on our entry, like prime board, right? So if we go back to like the Dash A here, so this is going to be one of our cheapest boards. This one is still going to give you the vertical mount, right? And you're still going to have the heatsink option down here with the thermal isolation. So regardless, it's going to be a value proposition. That doesn't matter which board you get, you're going to get
the
that.
negative on that is you're not going to see the really cool Corsair sticker that we designed for the M.2.
That's why then you do it in the vertical mount, right?
Yeah, you got to do it in the vertical mount. You want to be able to see the cool sticker we spent hours designing.
That's the better option, for sure. Another question from chat, from Gadget Joe. Are there any water-cooled X299 boards lined up? Or any that you can talk about, I guess?
So we are, of course, as always, looking into that. I mean, we've now started to do a number of different boards where we have that as an option. Not 100% confirmation that the Extreme will have that essentially in play. But I think what we're doing for water cooling enthusiasts, whether you're looking at closed-loop water cooling or full custom water cooling, is all the boards have continued our focus on fan connectivity and control. So we've got dedicated headers that are built onto the motherboard. So I think we can show you a slide that shows you the number of fan connections that we have for our fan control. We've got dedicated headers for all-in-one pumps. This is great. So like if you're connecting it, before users like confused, it's like, where do I plug this in? Do I plug it in a chassis fan header? Do I plug it into a CP fan header? You don't know. You've got it dedicated there. You've got a dedicated water pump fan header. And then all the chassis fan headers, I think this is really cool, is that if we go back to kind of that little demo setup that we had in our back-end system, one of the cool things that all the boards have is, right here, what I've got here is it's just a cheap PWM fan splitter cable. So normally, like in a 3-fan scenario on a chassis, I'd normally have to run 3 cables to 3 different headers on a board. But all of our boards give you full PWM output control. So that means I can just run one of these to one chassis fan header, and then I can put this in, run this to the bottom cavity in my nice Corsair chassis, pull that into the back, connect my 3 fans, and now all 3 of those fans are controlled and grouped with just one header. That makes the control and flexibility way more usable and really friendly. And that's something that every single one of these boards offers. And even for this generation, we took the fan controls further, where we gave you also the ability to have your fans respond to the GPU temperature. So here you can see the number of fan headers that something like the Strix has. It's crazy. You got all these different fan headers built on board, 3 pins, 4-pin fans, doesn't matter which Corsair fan you pop in there. Static pressure, ML series, whatever you're going to get, they can control, calibrate, profile them, and you can have them respond to different zones, which is pretty cool, because most of you probably don't even think about, do you know what your fan is always responding to? It's usually always the CPU, but actually the hottest running part usually in your system is not the CPU, it's actually the graphics card. And so here, for this generation, you can set your fans to respond to the GPU temperature instead. So have your front intake fans. So that's really cool.
Nice. Did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, that's a cool little accessory there. It comes with like our higher-end boards, like our deluxe series, but it's in a little accessory that you can get. It's $20 that connects to a lot of our boards. It's called what we call our fan extension card. So the cool thing is you can plug it into the board, and if you even want more physical headers or you want more temperature sources, it comes with an extension cable, so you can also isolate. You don't have to worry about running all the cables straight to the motherboard. Just connect it there, bring it in, mount it on the back of your chassis, and you can run 3 more fans there. So a lot of flexibility.
Great option for water coolers, because like JJ said, it's got the thermal probe connection points there. and you always need more fans, especially if you're doing a really high-end water-cooled system. with
Yes,
lots of radiators.
split loops. Maybe you have a loop just for the GPU and another loop for just the CPU. So a lot of
And
flexibility.
does that come in the box with the X99?
With the deluxe,
X299
yeah,
deluxe?
yeah. With the higher end boards, usually we're going to try to offer it. With the more of our entry boards, let's say like something like the Dash 8, it won't have it in the box, but it supports it.
Okay, cool.
I got another question from chat, really quick. This is about crypto mining, and if there's going to be any potential ASUS motherboards that are tailored or aimed at cryptocurrency miners. Not miners like under 18 years of age, but like, you know.
I think anybody that's interested in that, there's 3 things you're going to need to do. Any of our boards, they're really built to high quality. I'd probably go with a Tough Series board where we really hammer the design to be able to run for extended reliability points. And then get yourself a really good quality power supply. Go for, I go for their top shelf, like Platinum Series where you've got the really high quality topology, really beefy high quality capacitors, and then get yourself some good cooling because
And invest in solar panels.
Yeah, especially if you're in
You don't want to
California.
pay for the electricity.
That's
for
probably one
this.
of the best arguments for like a really high-end platinum or titanium rated power supply.
Yeah,
is it
because
just
literally every
translates
penny you
directly to
save.
money
Yeah,
with the-
and we
with the
have.
mining
I mean,
rate.
we were one of the first guys to have a titanium. In fact, we were the first guy to have titanium certified power supply with the AX1500i. In fact, that certification was almost basically created for that product. It didn't really exist before that. And it, we're not going to lie to you. There's not a huge reason if you're just kind of a gamer who's building a regular system to go out of your way and go from gold or platinum level up to titanium. That extra 2 or 3% is amazing if you're running a data center. It's not so much. It doesn't matter to you too much if you're going from 92 to 94% efficiency, unless you're crypto mining. If you've got a host of 580s on a bunch of milk crates in your air-conditioned closet, then yeah, that's probably the time that you might want to think about that extra 2% of efficiency, because provided you survived the Ethereum crash yesterday, then you should be okay.
But I think also that a good point to your guys' power supply range. I mean, I think you guys have really come to know to offer great quality and value across even like your entry level series. But there is value not just in the efficiency and wattage on the higher end. Your guys' like internal component quality. Take for instance like me, I'm out towards like the Davis area. It gets pretty warm right now in the summer. I'm hitting 110 degrees already. The ambient temperature that you have in one part.
That's Fahrenheit though, right?
Yeah. Yes, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's still a point because the heat correlates to efficiency in power supplies. So you might find that if you're in an area that gets really, really warm temperatures, you might want to invest in maybe like an RM, or you might want to go into an AX. Why? Because the internal components are rated for higher temperatures.
Well, yeah, so like almost all of our power supplies are rated for 50 degrees C, right?
Yeah.
So they're rated for what is basically a server grade. The higher end power supplies like the AX series or the HX series have higher end components, so a little bit better capacitors, a little bit better transistors, all these things add, and then the design overall creates better voltage regulation, better ripple and noise, stuff like that. Actually, basically anything from kind of RMX series up is kind of staggeringly good compared to where power supplies were even just like 3 or 4 years ago. And 3 or 4 years ago, people were starting to say like, oh, have we reached this kind of peak where peak power supply quality is no longer important and gold is good enough for everybody? It's like, well, we found that, okay, so once you've got to that kind of efficiency plateau, there are all kinds of other advantages you could do for longevity, noise level. All these things have like fanless modes until load, RM series and higher, all have fanless mode until about 40% load. Which is something back in the day, you would never even have heard of on a power supply, and now it's like basically standard for even our kind of mainstream power supplies, which is great because if you have a regular system, like if you just have like a single 580 and you're running like a Ryzen or a Core i7 7700K on a Z270 board, if you have that type of a platform, then you're only going to take 350, 400 watts max at load, but buying a 750 watt power supply will allow you to be fanless even when you're at full load at that point.
Which is great because it just, especially for me, I've got a lot of systems at home, but one of my systems, my primary, my daily driver, actually I keep on my desk, so it's right next to me. So I'm always looking for a sustained, really quiet operation from every component, right?
Yeah.
And so that's great when you go to a high quality PSU like that, because you're going to be able to, like, if I'm just surfing the net, looking at Reddit, watching YouTube videos, watching your guys' latest stream, right? Whatever it might be, it's going to be quiet.
I will say this, I noticed that after I got married, the wife acceptance factor of my computer was directly related to how loud it was. Like, it's an inverse relationship. So like, the louder my computer, the less cool my wife was with it. So now everything's liquid cooled and like really overkill on the power supply front, like just comic overkill.
Okay, we had a
Beautiful.
We had a couple. There's a question out here. We'll come to you in just a sec. A couple questions in chat. Any plans for Corsair to make a closed loop M.2 water cooler.
A little AAO that just ties under your M.2.
Something
Yeah,
like that.
sure, why not?
AAO.
Let's put it on the roadmap. Let's do it.
All right.
Call it a day.
All right, that's been
Good
added.
call, whoever that was. We'll
Adding
get
it
you
to the
some
product
royalties.
stack. All right, we got a question out here? Yes.
Good afternoon, guys. Question for JJ. This gets back to the mining thing. It was reported yesterday on CNBC News that by Jim Cramer of the Street that NVIDIA in the last 10 days sold over $100 million of cards, of video cards. And the only reason the AMD number is nowhere near close to that is because there's nothing else to sell anymore. The thing is, right now the mining thing has turned into the PC industry's biblical locust sword. They have come in and they have basically leveled AMD stock flat, and now they're working on NVIDIA stuff. And I'm just wondering, I have heard very little in terms of top management positions of both AMD, Intel, of how they're going to deal with this, because right now I know that AMD is consumed with Vega.
Yep.
But the thing is, this is going to wreak all sorts of havoc. And I'm just wondering, what positions have you heard from your people?
Yeah, you know, I can't.
Just to
say the
repeat
question
the
again,
question.
Yeah, oh yes, yes. So his question, it's a little bit kind of in the larger framework of maybe like a really high-end performance like this. There's been a really storm of interest as well as demand in people looking towards cryptocurrencies and bit mining and things along those lines, and essentially how that is influencing the component availability and what we're trying to do to be able to figure out strategies. And so what we do, we're an agnostic partner here. We're talking about Intel, but we support both AMD platforms, Intel platforms, and AMD graphics cards, and NVIDIA graphics cards. And so we definitely are very conscious of this because we see a lot of allocation going to these different types of places. And for us, ultimately, first and foremost, we want our components to be best served by the enthusiasts that are going to use them for their intended purposes. And so I think what we're looking at right now are strategies to try to work from e-tail partners on maybe kind of bundling opportunities where maybe we try to tie in products that are complementary to each other. So we know that somebody's maybe buying an X299. Maybe if they pair it with a GPU, we can help to ensure better allocation opportunities. There's a lot of conversations that there's complexity in how this works within the distribution channels and things like that are going out. But I can definitely tell you this is conversation. A lot of this has been happening very quickly, so it's been difficult to have the industry adapt to it, but we are actively looking at how we can try to manage the process and try to fight to make sure that allocation and availability is out there for the people that are interested in it. But it is still going to fall to ultimately the victim of what drives the market.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge because there's two sides to it. Like as a company, we sell high wattage power supplies, and when there's a mining craze, hey, we're stoked. We're high-fiving each other in the hallways. That's awesome. We can't make enough 1,000 watts and 1,500 watt power supplies. They're flying off shelves. I mean, some of the guys in Asia hit their yearly numbers in May. It's okay, great. But on the other side of it, those aren't the guys who brought us here, right? We became popular because we were selling stuff to gamers and enthusiasts and overclockers, and those are the guys who brought us to the party. And it's like, you don't ignore your core customer, right? So it's a tough balance. You got to have a business side of it and sell your product, but you also want to make sure that the guys who actually want to use it for what the product was intended for originally, which was kind of gaming and overclocking and building just really cool fast PCs that you actually are going to use yourself and not just park in a farm somewhere in a warehouse or a garage. Those guys should be able to buy it too.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. I wish I could tell you oh yeah, we're just going to say 40% if you have to be using it for gaming and the other 60% can use it for mining. There's no way to really do it easily. So it really has to be kind of an ad hoc plan. The pro and negative of mining is that the negative is it showed up instantly. It just pops up. Whatever is happening right now over the last 3 months basically came out of nowhere. If you talked about this mining stuff in January and February, it was nowhere near where it is right now, right? So that came on pretty quickly. And the supply chain for power supplies and for things like GPUs is not short. It's not like you can just, 2 weeks, let's crank it up and we'll make more. It's months it's measured. So the pro side is that for you guys, this stuff could all end quickly too. It could just be suddenly, they decide that, like with Bitcoin, when ASICs came out and all the guys started moving from PCs to ASICs mining, basically power supply stuff just kind of fell off a cliff at that point. Something similar could happen for Ethereum. We don't know. They could fork the chain or something. Who knows? Anything could happen. So the one kind of constant about altcoin mining and Bitcoin mining is there is no constant. It's going to be chaos forever, at least in the short term. I'm sure that long term, the guys that are actually huge mining guys are going to tell me how wrong I am and how it's going to be the standard, fungible currency of choice for everything in 10 years. But they said that 10 years ago, so we'll see.
I think the flip side, if there is any like bounce back after this, if you look at what happened in 2013 when Bitcoin first took off, when the ASICs did take over, there was a sudden influx into the market of very inexpensive graphics cards. So maybe that's coming, but like we said, there's
Yeah,
no real way
that's
to
true.
tell.
Like
Yeah.
if something happens to Ethereum, you guys will be able to buy 580s for like
Oh yeah,
nothing.
yeah, they should be dirt cheap.
Yeah, and
Who
I
knows
think
how much usage they've gotten, but
so one last point to that too, just to kind of hopefully end on that, is we also are trying to look at ways of structuring potential product stack that is more in line with those type of usage models to try to make sure that there's more of a segmentational opportunity. I mean, people are going to buy what they want to buy, but we also are trying to be cognizant that there's a lot of functions and features that we built onto product that are not used by that market. So there may be opportunities to try to shift that drive into a product portfolio that's been designed for that base. So, those are all things that we're trying to work on to help to manage that.
All right. Any other questions in the audience? So we got a couple. You in the back. No, yeah, you.
JJ, can you give some details about Turbo 3.0 with Skylake X, including favorite/best core?
Yeah. So
Just really quick, the question was, could you give some details on Turbo 3.0 and how that all works?
Yeah, so one really brilliant thing that Intel did for this generation is they took essentially their turbo technology, which is essentially built-in overclocking into the CPU, and made it even more intelligent to work beyond just one core and down to 2 cores. And they essentially, Intel, through its fabrication process, selects 2 cores that they know have the best performance, and they can ratchet it up to a higher frequency. And so this essentially allows the CPU to be able to offer really, really impressive single thread performance or light thread performance, along with still then being able to leverage all those cores once you ship into multi-threaded applications. On our end, how we also leverage working with this is like we talked about in the UEFI options in our auto tuning technology, giving the ability to customize essentially these different types of setups for when you overclock. So if you want to dial in 1 or 2 threads at a much higher frequency, then you have that ability to overclock further. A lot of people, when they overclock, kind of don't realize that you could be leaving megahertz, quote unquote, on the floor. So if I've got a 7900X, right, and I try to take all 10 cores and I try to run them all at 5 gigahertz, maybe not all of them can run at 5 gigahertz, right? But maybe 2 of them can run, or maybe 4 of them can run, and then maybe on all core they could run at 4.6. And so the turbo technology that Intel's built in and the ability to kind of go in and target this really allows you to maximize your overclocking capability. But Turbo, I think 3.0, the most impressive part to it is that it's finally given us essentially this parity experience that normally when we're looking at the mainstream enthusiast side of the fence, you were always going to get better single-threaded performance. But now you kind of get almost that best of both worlds experience. You're still able to get really great performance in single-thread applications that are comparable essentially to that 7700K, but you're still going to totally get that monster performance when you jump into multi-threaded apps.
And like you were saying, a chain, that was the sense, the chain's as strong as the weakest link, right? So like if you have a whole bunch of CPU cores, whatever the slowest core is, that used to be your top speed.
Yeah.
Like, okay, if out of your 12 cores, if 11 of them can do 5, but one can only do 4.7, you got a 4.7 gigahertz processor, basically. So 3.0 kind of fixes that problem. With memory, it's a benefit because we can actually screen the ICs individually. You can't really do that with CPU cores and take 1 core at a time and then create a super CPU. Like, that's how we make high-end memory. We take each little chip and we screen it out, and we bin them out, and we say, okay, so we go buy a huge lot of memory, and maybe 10% can hit 4600, and those 10% all get binned and made into 4600 modules, and then so on and so on down the pike.
Yeah.
But that you can't really do that with CPUs.
And that's why now having the ability to do that per core tuning at least allows you to kind of bin your CPU by you tuning it yourself to kind of get that best performance. And even to that point, this is something that we've now had for a couple of generations, and we've continued to put in. But we even have the ability within our actual software, and this is also part of Intel's Turbo 3.0 driver when it's installed now on an X299 system, is that we can do application-specific overclocking. This is, in my opinion, mind-blowing. Many people have not covered this since it's been implemented by Intel, but that literally means that, hey, if I'm opening up Chrome, right? Why do I need Chrome to run an overclock configuration, right? Maybe I only want to run the overclock when I'm in my game, or when I'm like in Adobe Premiere because I want better rendering performance.
You want to see your GIFs load like that.
Well, the choice is up to you, but that's the cool thing is that even you can intelligently overclock based on the actual program. Yeah. So browsers actually tend to not be very well multi-threaded. Most of them run like 1 or 2 threads, right? Or like if you do photography and you open up like Lightroom or like Zonar XPS or like Capture One, most of them only work on 1 or 2 threads. So guess what? AppTune and overclock the profile set up to that. So I could run like 2 cores at 5 gigs, right? And then the moment I go into Battlefield, that's all cores set to 4.6. Yeah. You have that ability within our software to be able to customize. It takes a little bit of time, but you can go in and per application define that. And we even have that linked into things like fan profiles or even audio optimizations, where the moment that you jump into one program, we could automatically shift to, you open up Chrome, not only do we run at stock speeds, but we set every single fan to run silent. That means it won't even spin up. So the moment you're reading the internet, power consumption comes down. Perfect quiet, lowest power consumption, great efficiency. The moment I jump into my game, fan profile gets set to turbo response. So not crazy loud, but enough to give me consistent airflow at the most aggressive frequency. This is, in my opinion, game-changing way of approaching system tuning that most of us are still approaching system tuning the same way that we were doing it literally probably 15 years ago, which is kind of sad because there's so much work that's been done on the R&D side from Intel as well as our side, and also even all the other hardware you get, the great memory, you know, the quality power supplies, the cooling solutions, all that stuff. So it's kind of worth the effort of trying to figure out how you can best tune your system.
Awesome. All right. We've got another, actually a pretty good question here in chat. That's not, you know, totally awful. But this is, I guess, more targeted towards like maybe someone who's interested in Kaby Lake X, for example, because I mean the X299 platform is pretty. There's a wide range of CPUs, right? Ranging from anywhere from 16 up to 44 PCIe lanes.
Yep.
And so
4 cores up to what? 4 core up to 18 cores, 36 threads. That's a huge string.
Absolutely. So I guess when it comes to, you know, buying into a platform that has this wide range of options, if you were going the Kaby Lake X route, where you were only talking 16 PCIe lanes, is it possible that ASUS maybe might make a motherboard, or is it even possible to make a motherboard with fewer PCIe lanes, kind of shave some of the PCIe lanes to reduce the cost overall for someone who might be buying into that platform?
The cost is pretty much fixed on a motherboard side from Intel's perspective. Like the chipset cost is standardized, right? What influences motherboard cost is going to be what you guys, you know, want from feature set, right? So that's like, okay, Sabertooth comes with, you know, thermal armor. It comes with dual NICs. It comes with more USB ports, right? It comes with an assist fan. It comes with higher quality, you know, VRM components, right? I think on our perspective, that's the reason why we offer like the, you know, the entry boards are going to be like the Dash A or the Tough Mark 1. So Tough Mark 1 is going to be about a $250 board, but you could of course go up to something deluxe and be almost at the $450 price point. So I think we've tried to design a price band that aligns with those CPUs. But the great thing is that even on those quote-unquote entry boards, you haven't compromised, I think, on any key things that you want. Like I/O spec, everything's going to have USB 3.0, 3.1, Type A, Type C. You still get the M.2 heatsink. You get the fan controls, the auto overclocking, improved audio design, right? Dual M.2 support, even support for like the Thunderbolt 3 expansion card, all that stuff. So I think our perspective is more so buy based on what you want from a functionality standpoint, not off of a presumed assumption that because I buy a higher end board, right? It's just like when you were talking about your power supplies, you know you're going to get a great PC. If I buy an HX or RM, it's very good. Doesn't mean that I'm going to get somehow a massively degraded experience because I didn't buy an AX, right?
I mean, I think for Kaby Lake X, the customer that makes the most sense is the guy who eventually is going to go to Skylake X or whatever.
Yeah, they see an upgrade path.
Yeah, they want the reason, because it's the same price as the 7700K for the processor. And the Z270 boards are significantly cheaper than the X299 boards will be generally.
Comparatively, right? Because Z270 boards, we can get very expensive.
But you can buy a really decent Z270 board for a lot less than you can buy an entry-level X299.
It's about a $100 delta.
So the reasoning for me is, like, if I'm going to buy a Kaby Lake X, it's because eventually I'm going to go get a 16-core or a 24-core or whatever in a year or two when they have that. And I want an entry into that. So the idea of buying an X299 board with, you know, only 16 lanes on it or something like that, it would basically eliminate that headroom to go to that new processor in the future. So at that point, you might as well just buy the Z270, like, because the only real reason to go 299 over 270 is the potential headroom to get the Skylake X and the more cores and things like that.
Yeah, it's about definitely, it's a focus on, you know, I think the value prop to me is I don't know if somebody's going to jump all the way to, you know, 18 core, but I think that there are legitimately people that could be on Kaby Lake X that goes to the gentleman that asked about the 7820X. That's a pretty sweet CPU. I mean, I think the performance overclocking and the huge multi-core increase, I could legitimately go, okay, maybe in 2 years I jump up to a CPU that gives me, you know, 6-core 12 thread, right? Or 8-core, 16-thread, and that delta is not a huge amount, but then all of a sudden I unlock way better multi-threaded performance, and I get the quad channel, I get the more PCI Express lane. So I think that's who that target is. But to that point also, what we have also seen in initial testing is Kaby Lake X, because of the increased power envelope that essentially it has on this platform, is also allowing for a little bit even more overclocking margin than what we see on 7700K. So even though there's parity in those parts, we are still seeing that for really the person that cares about performance, they're going to be able to wrangle out even a little bit more out of that on X299. But you have to really be somebody that's overclocking. If you're not overclocking, then it probably makes more sense for you to consider Z270.
Beautiful. We have any other
Great
questions?
answers.
Okay.
Thank you guys.
Question from the audience.
Are there any concerns with the ASUS RGB software corrupting the memory SPD information?
So we've worked with.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting that. He was asking essentially. So one of the things is we've worked with a number of different partners on enabling RGB support with that, and what we found is that it's more inherent to the way that you program the memory in general. It's not to do with our quote-unquote software. So it's just part of the implementation of working within this. And so we're actively working with a wide range of partners to do that. And I think overall what we're finding is that as we mature the UEFI options, the software, working with those partners, everything is going to work well, And so I think long-term we see that this is just kind of initial teething that some users are kind of running into.
So there's on the SPD, there's a huge block of memory, the block of writable areas that not all of them are used, right? And so there's a big bunch of area that we just don't use for anything, and so that's why we're able to do RGB RAM control over the SM bus. We don't have to use extra cables or extra wires and have a little controller. We can do Vengeance RGB works over the SM bus. The reason it's able to do that is because there's a bunch of the SPD that's not used. Once it's kind of understood that section of the SPD is what we're using for control, and then if the other guys decide they're going to follow that suit and say, oh yeah, well Corsair is doing this, we'll use this area of the SPD for our control too, which by the way has happened like 100 out of 100 times. So once we start doing it, we'll see all the competitors start doing it, and eventually you guys and Gigabyte and whoever else that's involved in it, it's going to go into their BIOS and set it up. So that's how the RGB memory guys control RGB memory. It just becomes a de facto industry standard. So.
Yeah, and to your point, like I said, we've already done that at this stage, and so I think as of right now, I don't really see that being an issue. It's only going to continue to improve.
Yeah, so we actually now some of the stuff works on Aura software right now. So we have the Vengeance RGB that works through that and syncs to that now. ASUS has been pretty good at partnering with us on that, and we've been able to get that working. So most people shouldn't be too worried about it. But you're right, at the beginning of this technology things, there's always that kind of teething stage where something doesn't work or something goes horribly wrong. But that's why we have pretty good warranties and service stuff for all that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. A lot of times one of the things that people always look at, people buy a lot based on pure spec. But I think experience and the way that a product gets supported in the long term is really important, especially for a high-end platform like this. If you take a look at something like firmware or UEFI releases for ASUS boards on the last 3 high-end platform generations, we have exponentially beat every other competitor in the amount of long-term support we've given on the number of UEFI releases. One, we refreshed our motherboards less than any other vendor. So we usually only release one launch board and then maybe like a refresh like 2 years later. That's very important because that means we designed it right the first time and then we refresh based on user feedback on spec that they wanted upgraded. What it also allows for is very great stability in being able to make sure that we release UEFI updates or firmware updates for the motherboards for a very long period of time. So if you look at like X99, X79, you're talking in the range of 15 to sometimes 20 UEFI releases across like 2.5, 3.5 years. That's really important because as a user, if I make the purchase and new M.2 drive comes out from Corsair, new memory comes out, this new option comes out, this new add-in card comes out, they might be things that we have to tune for. You don't want to make the investment in a $250, $350, $450 product and then be shortchanged by the vendor because they decided to not firmware update the board. And that's an unseen cost, but it is part of the total cost of what we have to do on the back end, right? The reason why, ASUS is always going to cost you a little bit more, but we also put more long-term R&D support into the back end of the boards than really anybody else out there.
Quick question from chat, JJ. This is from Golan Bender. When will the ASUS boards Memory QVL, when will it be on the asus.com site? Can we expect that in the next few days?
I definitely, by launch day, it'll be up there pretty quick. I also stressed like I said, if you want to get the most comprehensive QVL, our QVL, we try to be active in updating it, but you can also reference, a lot of times, partners like Corsair, they'll integrate the QVL and the boards that they validated on their page. Yep. And you can also, like I said, always go to Intel's website on the XMP portion. They have actually a downloadable doc where they actually have to qualify every single XMP module that gets the certification. Because for those of you not in the know, XMP is Intel's memory specification. It's extreme memory profile.
And for those of you guys who don't know, Corsair has by far the most DDR4 on the XMP list. So we work really closely with Intel to make sure that almost all of our high-end overclocking stuff is on the XMP list, so it's guaranteed to work if the board is XMP compatible. And like JJ mentioned, if you go to them, if you say, oh, I really like these Vengeance RGB 3600 sticks, they look great, and there's a good deal on them right now at Amazon or Newegg or whatever. I'm going to go check it on Corsair's website and see what boards they're compatible with. We sometimes will have that list set up, so we'll show you exactly what we tested it on and what we run it on.
And that might be faster than us, because like I said, on our QVL, we might not always go back to that support page and update that, but it didn't mean that we didn't work with Corsair directly during the development time.
There's memory is, the joke in the memory industry is memory is like produce, right? It goes bad quickly because the prices change so fast. So when we were buying something today from vendor B, then we screen it and we spend 2 weeks doing it, and then a month from now, vendor B is like, yeah, we stopped making that because we have to make flash drives for Apple for their new laptops. Then we have to go to vendor C and vendor D and do all that stuff. So we can launch and then sell and then EOL like a memory product in like a month and a half, 2 months. Whereas, he was just mentioning motherboards, 2 years, 3-year lifespan, especially with the recent BIOS updates or UEFI updates all the time. So we see that the memory is released much more frequently. So they can't constantly update their list, but we can update our list pretty frequently.
Yeah. And one last point to that as well, for people that make purchase on memory, especially on a quad channel platform like this, I stress buy native quad channel kits. When partners like Corsair have taken the time to validate those modules, they've checked that the timings and the frequencies are designed for all 4 of those DIMMs to work at that rated frequency. We sometimes see users that will want to buy like 2 dual channel kits at a cheaper price and put them together. That doesn't mean that you might not be able to get it working, but the timings and the frequency for 4 sticks of memory to run in that paired configuration versus 4 sticks of dual channel memory, even if they're the quote unquote same, there could be subtle timing differences that are just a little bit different where it could cause an instability issue. Doesn't mean you can't go in and maybe manually tune those parameters, but if you don't know how to do that, you're going to deal with maybe more headache than if you would have just spent the extra, whatever, $20 that it might be to make sure to get the native quad channel kit. So I strongly advise, if you can, try to make sure that you're buying native memory.
Yeah, it's tested it's tested in the actual boards. We don't just have a simulator or something like that. We actually buy, the 10 or 20 most popular boards and we put the memory in it and test it that way. So.
Nice. Anyone from the audience have another question? Anyone at all? You right there in the front.
Okay, I want to start my own water cooling system. Does any of these motherboards or any of these water components have any kind of detection for water or if it breaks? I know that Kyle knows that even AIOs break. He loves to use
This is true.
Does happen.
Yep.
Painful memories.
So the question is there going to be any sort of water leak detection for custom water coolers or even AIO users on X299 boards from ASUS?
So we did kind of really pioneer that really with the Extreme board by building in an actual mechanism that allowed for breach sensing, but it's quite a bit of an advanced technology. You don't even have add-in partners. There's no block that's ever been made that has had that natively built in. So that's still a pretty expensive offering. So there's nothing built like that, but what I will say is actually almost all the boards actually have specialized coatings on them. So in most situations, unless you're going with a very dramatic leak that would get onto everything, generally a little bit of water is not going to just, I'm not actually really that scared because it wouldn't really kill the board.
It's also off, which is the important
part. CPUs in there.
I mean, exactly. If you probably spilled a little bit on there, like I said, you dried it off right away and then just let it sit and you dried, and then when you put it back in after it was dried, probably everything would turn entirely back on. What I actually tell more people than not, if you're going to do custom water cooling, so I'm assuming not like closed-loop water cooling, because really for a lot of the closed-loop cooling solutions, yes, an AIO could potentially fail, but the quality control that I think Corsair and partners have done is quite good. The main thing is if you use compression fittings, biggest thing that I think people forget about, compression fittings have a bit of expansion that occurs after you initially compress them and torque them down. So the golden rule of thumb is at least I'd say about a week and a half to these 2 weeks after you finish your whole build, make sure go back and then retighten your compression fittings. And then I just set like a reminder on your phone or something like that. Check it once a month. Just make sure those compression fittings are tight and clean. And overall, I think you'll be fine.
And if you do to go with an all-in-one cooler like an H115 or something like that, we will warranty, if it does, like stuff happens, we sell tens and tens of thousands of these things every month. If something happens and the system breaks and it leaks on your components and it was our fault, we replace all the components it killed. So just an FYI, we stand behind those things. That's been the way we've been doing it for the past 8 years. It's basically a standard policy. We very rarely have to do it because it very rarely happens. But I don't want anyone to get all upset and they found out, oh man, my $1,000 graphics card just got killed by my $60 CPU cooler. That's never going to happen. So, and if it does happen, we'll replace it for you.
Yeah, and I'll say also too, I don't think I've ever had a closed loop cooler leak on me. I think the likelihood probably of I've had a pump fail more than I've had an actual leak failure.
I mean, the most likely thing to die is the fan, actually. You know, the fans have the shortest lifespan of anything in that thing. So the mean time between failures for those is like 50,000 hours instead of 170,000 or whatever the pump is. So,
and they've improved considerably. I mean, from the very first generations also to now. I think that's the other thing. There's like a myth, a lot of times in the industry, is that sometimes first initial impressions kind of influence people, even though they're no longer that way anymore.
Yeah.
So for the most part, it's not really. I think a genuine concern that you have to be worried about.
One last point I wanted to make, and obviously I can't speak for JJ, but the Maximus 9 Extreme on Z270 is the ASUS motherboard that has that leak detection block that comes with it. And JJ did confirm the Rampage 6 Extreme is in the works. I don't know if those two go together. Oh yeah, it was on display at Computex.
Yeah.
So there it is.
It's a good looking board.
Yeah.
It's an expensive.
Not with that block though.
Not with that block though.
Yeah.
But who knows for sure?
You never know.
We can't really confirm details on unreleased products, right?
Yeah.
That's the usual vendor line. Okay. Any other questions?
Any other questions from the audience? I thought I saw another hand up earlier. There you go.
RGB question. I saw the video on SyncIt.
Yeah.
I like ASUS design, so is there any way for them to...
For us to sync it? Is that what you're asking? Could Corsair and ASUS potentially work together and create some kind of RGB like Uber product that everything works together perfectly? Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussions going on. I think that, I mean, not to say anything too businessy, but there are legitimate business concerns because there's IP on the ASUS side, there's IP on our side. We don't want to have necessarily open to SDK to everybody and that type of stuff. But I think that we have the demo we showed at Computex, the SyncIt demo. That product that'll be productized in the next 6 to 12 months sometime. Where you'll see that all of the products will work together on the Corsair side. And like I said, we've opened already, so you can control the Vengeance RGB through Aura software now. So you'll see that getting closer and closer. I mean, quite honestly, you guys won't tolerate it if we don't. So it'll happen sooner or later.
And I think from our perspective, like I noted earlier, we've released now an API that we've made available to all partners to not only allow for hardware partnerships, but like I said, also software partnerships. And I think there's two perspectives, as George has also noted. I think for us, we holistically see a vision of really tying things in, because when people adopt like a motherboard, it ties in really closely to kind of being able to manage everything well connected together. But I think also having isolated, dedicated solutions like what Corsair has done, not only for, let's say, like fans, even though a lot of the functionality that we have supersedes needing a discrete fan controller because we have that built on the motherboard, not everybody buys everything at one time. Right? What happens if I'm bringing over RGB fans, or I'm having strips and I'm bringing it to like X299 or Z97? There's merit to having isolated components, but I think that, like I said, that doesn't take away that for future products and future native products that we try to work as closely as possible. So I think definitely that's only going to continue to work better. And ASUS and Corsair have had a really long and extensive relationship. That we pretty much, when it comes to innovative key technologies that drive this platform, we're usually lockstep more often than not. So I think that's going to continue to be the case.
Okay.
I feel like you guys merging your LEDs with the Aura software and whatnot, I feel like that's the final missing link between your guys' super close relationship. Because I remember like back at Newegg when Paul and I were still working there, we were like, all right, we're going to part our system. What should we use? Well, technically, we could just go with ASUS and Corsair, and apart from the CPU, that's the entire system. And I still feel like I gravitate towards that often.
I mean, technically, you have to involve either Intel or AMD at some point.
I know, but you got to invite them to the party.
They have to be. I mean, they're kind of the brains of the operation in that system. But
true.
But the rest of it, yeah, we can handle.
Yeah.
So,
excellent. All right. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Any question at all? There are no stupid questions. That's a lie. But if it's okay, we'll forgive you.
I do have a question from chat that I've asked George before, but I'll ask it again.
Yeah. Okay.
Is Corsair ever going to do an air cooler?
We did an air cooler.
Okay, again.
Again, yeah. No, we're not going to do an air cooler again,
Okay.
probably. We had a parking lot full of 30,000 of them because no one bought them. They took like 9 months and like 30 parking spaces, so that's not happening anytime soon. I can't announce unannounced products or talk about unannounced products, but I would be very suspicious if an air cooler showed up from Corsair tomorrow because I would have known about it and I don't. So if you guys see an air cooler from Corsair, send me an email or something and say, hey, what's this? Is it legit? And I'd be like, no, it's a knockoff from China or something. And, you know, super fancy tech decided they were going to knock off the Corsair
Would
logo.
it have the Corsair gaming logo on it?
We don't talk about
Sorry,
that.
I'm not supposed to bring that up. Okay.
All right. But
Any final questions from the audience out here?
We'll do one more question if there is one.
If it
You.
exists.
You've been
Yes, sir.
chosen.
So this question is kind of ties in between both JJ and George. The header on the motherboard for front I/O or a case. For a lot of first-time builders, that can be a little bit of a milestone that people have to really kind of to focus on being a little bit of a difficult portion of a build. Has there ever been considerations to have more of a standardized all-in-one connector instead of having more individual pins?
Yeah, I know. Yes, so your question, he's asked essentially about the, you know, the
Front
fearsome
panel
the front panel I/O connectivity.
I/O.
Yeah. So and how that can be a challenging point for some builders, you know, as far as kind of getting all the leads in there connected. It can be sometimes a little bit of a painstaking process. So a long time ago, you know, we were really the first vendor that unilaterally tried to tackle improving that by making our Q connector, which comes with many of our boards, that allowed you
the
to.
shirt, the Q connector shirt?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I still want a Q connector shirt.
That allowed you to essentially go ahead and make your connections outside and then plug it to the motherboard. And actually, we saw that it was so popular that actually every vendor outside of ASUS has also copied the same type of design approach.
You trendsetters, you.
Yeah.
But of course, an even more elegant solution might be trying to have like a block header which inside the chassis. The tricky part to that is that there are certain kind of headers that aren't necessarily always standardized, and there's bigger kind of things that kind of have to come into the conversation and play. These are not necessarily all off on the table. A good example is like the front USB 3.1 header. This actually came through discussion with us as well as directly with Intel and the USB-IF sanction group because we wanted to come up with a better connection for this next generation standard because the current USB 3 header was not so
Terrible.
hot. Anybody that
Gets
sees
a lot
that
of hate.
header,
Gets a lot of hate.
it's
Like one of my it's like the worst since the floppy connector.
yeah,
Like,
it's to me, I hate putting in that cable more than
No,
I hate putting
yeah.
in any other
it's
cable.
that giant overmold on
Yeah.
it that's like.
And so
that
if
cable.
we see the proof of there, we've definitely seen it become better. Now, what I will say is we have looked at the opportunity of maybe creating our own custom molding blocks. So this is kind of interesting for some concept boards that we've evaluated for like aesthetic purposes. We've considered certain things like an entire block that actually goes over the entirety of your I/O section that makes one external breakout box that would like maybe go into like a 5 1/4 hard drive bay. So no cable would need to even be blocked in there. You would just literally have that covered on there, and then you just make all your connections really simply. So I think we're looking at it from both ways. Can we talk to partners and figure out, you know, what they can do there? There are challenges just like for them too, because I'm sure George can speak to this, tooling and part cost, and there's a lot of back-end things that kind of play into stuff that make it complicated that you might think, oh, can't you just do this easily and flip this on? But
Yeah.
it's not
I
necessarily
mean, so
that easy.
from my perspective as a case guy, you know, with all the little leads that come from the USB ports and the reset button and the power button and the power LED and the hard drive LED, like all that stuff, we could easily, ASUS has used the same pinout for that for, what, 10 years,
Yep.
basically. Like, it hasn't changed. Every single ASUS motherboard has had that same pinout for 10 years. If only your competitors would just do that, we could just make one little connector that snaps into that spot from a case perspective and everything would be fine. But it is kind of a pain when we have to be compatible with the motherboards people are actually buying. So it's like, okay, vendor A, vendor B, vendor C, we got to make sure on little tiny individual things. I've probably built over like 300 PCs in the last 10 years, and it's not an exaggeration. I really probably have built like close to 300 PCs. And every time I do it, I still check the power LED and hard drive LED to make sure I did it right. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I was the case PM for a long time. I stopped putting the hard drive LED in cases because I hated plugging it in. So, and plus no one actually cared. Like, so the hard drive's working. Yeah, I know.
I'm always still not 100% sure. I always have to double check. Is it flashing? Okay, it's flashing.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't flip them.
Or you reverse it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, guys, on that note, we are going to have to cut it off because we are short on time. But I'd like to first off thank George and JJ for providing all of their wisdom. Thank you guys so much for being here and for having us here Paul, thank you for being an outstanding co-host.
Thank you for being
quick-
also an
Thank you. Thank you.
you-
Quick round
you
of applause
talk,
for everyone up here. Yes. Also, huge thanks to all of you guys who are in our live audience right now. We wouldn't be here without all of you, as well as all of you watching at home on the interwebs. Thank you guys so much. I'm Kyle. This is Corsair and ASUS signing off. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you, guys.